The human experience is measured in the frantic ticking of seconds and the brief flicker of decades, a thin veneer of noise stretched over the silent, immovable foundation of deep time. We exist in a world of sunlight and thin air, yet beneath the familiar rhythm of our lives lies a history so vast it renders our entire civilization a mere statistical anomaly. To understand the Ordovician is to abandon the comfort of the surface and descend 450 million years into a liquid cathedral. It is a journey away from the green continents we know, back to a time when the Earth was a realm of wandering cratons and vast, unchecked oceans. Here, the very concept of a second dissolves into the slow tectonic pulse of a cooling planet, and the air we breathe is a distant, toxic memory. We begin our descent into the vertical wilderness of the Panthalassic wastes, where the water is not merely a medium but a crushing, physical presence. At these depths, the viscosity of the sea feels heavy, like a cold saline syrup pressing against the senses. The light of the sun, so dominant in our world, is stripped away layer by layer, filtered through the suspended silt of 1,000 ancient rivers until only a bruised indigo twilight remains. There is a profound stillness here, a silence so absolute it vibrates within the marrow of the bone. It is the sound of an entire planet breathing in the dark. The pressure at this horizon is an indifferent architect, shaping the biology of every living thing to withstand a weight that would collapse a modern vessel. Each cubic centimeter of water carries the gravity of the ages, a constant, unrelenting squeeze that dictates the slow, rhythmic pace of life in the Paleozoic deep. As the senses adjust to the gloom, the chemical signature of this ancient sea reveals itself. It is a world of high calcification and shifting oxygen gradients, where the cooling of the global climate has triggered a frantic explosion of biological ingenuity. The water is rich with the mineral wealth of eroding mountains, providing the raw materials for a new era of structural dominance. Beneath the surface tension, the great Ordovician biodiversification event is written in the very architecture of the seafloor. We see the first true masters of the water column, not the nimble fish of our modern era, but the armored titans of the cephalopod lineage. They are the sovereigns of the shell, biological machines designed for buoyancy and persistence in a world of shadows. Their nervous systems, primitive yet remarkably refined, are tuned to the subtle pressure waves of a passing predator or the chemical trail of a distant mate. These are the orthocones, the straight-shelled giants that define the Ordovician horizon. Their forms are long, tapering needles of calcium carbonate, some stretching longer than a modern bus, drifting with a ghostly horizontal grace through the lightless void. To look upon one is to see the physical manifestation of patience. They do not hurry, they do not struggle against the currents. They exist in a state of perfect hydrostatic equilibrium, their internal chambers filled with a delicate balance of gas and liquid that allows them to hover, weightless, in the crushing dark. This is the kingdom of the giant shells, a period of Earth's history where the strength of the exterior was the only protection against an indifferent universe. As we drift further into this submerged past, we realize that we are witnesses to a lost majesty, a time when the Earth belonged to the slow, the silent, and the armored. The Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event, or the GORB, represents a staggering inflection point in the narrative of terrestrial life, a moment where the simplicity of the Cambrian explosion matured into a complex, multi-layered ecological tapestry. To understand the magnitude of this shift, one must envision the seafloor not as a static graveyard, but as a vertical frontier. Before this era, life was largely tethered to the two-dimensional plane of the sediment, a carpet of organisms clinging to the mud. But as the Ordovician progressed, the oceans underwent a profound structural revolution. The cooling of the global climate and the shifting of tectonic plates released a surge of nutrients, triggering a biological gold rush that forced life to colonize the water column above and the substrate below. This was the birth of tiering, a sophisticated partitioning of the ocean, where species occupied specific altitudes of the sea, from the burrowing depths of the infauna to the drifting pioneers of the pelagic zone. The environmental catalyst for this explosion was a delicate synergy of geochemistry and orbital mechanics. The atmosphere, once choked with the residual heat of the Earth's formation, began to yield to a sustained cooling trend, allowing oxygen to dissolve more efficiently into the polar currents. These oxygen-rich waters acted as a circulatory system for the planet, carrying life-sustaining gas into the stagnant basins of the deep. As the thermal gradient shifted, the viscosity of the water changed, affecting the buoyancy and locomotive requirements of every larval form. We find ourselves in a world of increasing complexity, where the sheer volume of available niches invited a radical experimentation in morphology. The biodiversity didn't just grow, it tripled. It was a rhythmic expansion of form and function, a slow-motion firework of speciation that played out over millions of years of undisturbed oceanic stability. Central to this transformation was the rise of the filter feeders, the silent architects of the Ordovician reefs. Unlike the coral reefs of the modern world, these ancient structures were often composed of bryozoans, sponges, and the intricate lattice work of stromatoporoids. These organisms acted as living sieves, processing the microscopic wealth of the water column and turning sunlight and mineral salts into solid, calcified history. The sheer density of life in these zones created a sensory landscape of incredible richness. The vibration of a billion tiny cilia, the snapping of brachiopod valves, and the gentle scraping of gastropods on stone formed a low-frequency hum that resonated through the dark. This was a world of biological competition mediated by the slow accumulation of calcium, where the success of a lineage was measured by its ability to extract stability from the chaotic flow of the currents. As we observe the gob, we are looking at the foundational blueprint of all modern marine ecosystems. The strategies developed here, the complex food webs, the specialized predator-prey relationships, and the occupation of the open ocean have persisted through 5 mass extinctions. It is a sobering realization that the fundamental mechanics of our blue planet were refined in this ancient twilight, hundreds of millions of years before the first dinosaur walked the Earth. The goby was not merely an increase in numbers. It was the moment the ocean found its voice, a transition from a silent, barren waste to a crowded, clamoring theatre of existence. We are the descendants of this structural ambition, the distant heirs to a biological momentum that began in the cooling waters of a forgotten sea. The expansion of life was an unstoppable tide, a slow-motion surge that ensured no corner of the blue would ever be truly empty again. The shells of the great nautiloid, specifically the Titan Cameroceras, is not merely a defensive redoubt, but a masterpiece of prehistoric engineering. A pressurized vessel of calcium carbonates that defied the crushing weight of the Ordovician water column to run a hand along its surface. If one could transcend the eons would be to feel the cold, stony ribbing of a living fossil, a texture defined by the slow, incremental deposition of aragonite. This was the era of the straight shell, the orthoconic form that sliced through the water like a jagged needle. These shells were not the fragile, spiraled curiosities found on modern beaches. They were massive, structural beams of biological stone, some reaching lengths that would dwarf a great white shark. The shell functioned as a rigid exoskeleton, protecting the soft, vulnerable mantle of the cephalopod from the snapping mandibles of eurypterids and the jagged reefs of the shallows. Beneath the mottled, perhaps camouflaged exterior of the shell lay a complex internal geometry. The shell was divided into a series of transverse walls called septa, creating a sequence of distinct chambers that traced the animal's growth from its larval beginnings to its apex as a deep-sea predator. Only the outermost, largest chamber housed the living organism, a mass of muscle, tentacles, and a sophisticated beak. The remaining chambers, trailing behind like a silent wake of stone, were filled with a mixture of gas and saline fluid. This internal partitioning was the secret to the orthocone's dominance. By manipulating the ratio of gas to liquid within these sealed vaults, the creature could achieve a state of neutral buoyancy, hanging suspended in the water column with zero metabolic effort. It was a biological submarine, a vessel that utilized the very physics of the ocean to maintain its position in the dark. The true marvel of this architecture, however, was the siphuncular strand of living tissue that threaded through a small aperture in every single septum, connecting the living animal to the furthest, oldest chambers of its shell. This tube functioned as a sophisticated osmotic pump. Through the siphuncle, the nautiloid could regulate the salinity of the fluid within the chambers, drawing water out or allowing gas to diffuse in to adjust its depth. It was a slow, rhythmic process, a silent exchange of ions and gases that allowed the giant to rise and fall through the various layers of the Ordovician Sea. The engineering required to maintain such a vacuum at depths where the pressure would shatter bone is a testament to the sheer durability of the cephalopod blueprint. The shell was a sanctuary, a ballast, and a tool of locomotion all at once, a rigid testament to the necessity of structural integrity in a world of immense hydraulic force. To contemplate the shell of the Cameroceras is to reflect on the nature of protection and the cost of growth. Each septum represented a moment of expansion, a calculated risk taken by the organism to build a larger home for its growing body. As the animal matured, it left behind the chambers of its youth, turning them into the very tools that allowed it to conquer the vertical wilderness. This was a life defined by the accumulation of mineral wealth, a slow-motion construction project that resulted in one of the most imposing predators the world has ever seen. The shell was a bridge between the biological and the geological, a piece of the Earth's crust shaped by the will of a living mind. As these giants drifted through the indigo gloom, their shells whispered against the currents, a low tectonic friction that echoed the permanence of stone in an ever-shifting sea. To descend further into the mechanics of the Cameroceras is to encounter the silent, internal alchemy of the siphuncle, a specialized strand of vascular tissue that served as the lifeline between the living animal and its calcified history. In the crushing expanse of the Ordovician deep, buoyancy was not merely a matter of convenience, it was a precarious negotiation with the laws of physics. The siphuncle, a cord of flesh threading through the center of every chambered septum, acted as an osmotic pump of staggering efficiency. By altering the salt concentration within this living tube, the cephalopod could draw liquid out of its sealed chambers, creating a partial vacuum that was then filled with gas, predominantly nitrogen diffuse, from the animal's own bloodstream. This was not a rapid process, but a slow, rhythmic transition, a metabolic sigh that allowed the titan to adjust its weight against the relentless pull of the abyss. This biological ballast system allowed the giant shells to achieve a state of neutral buoyancy, a weightless suspension that rendered their massive size irrelevant to the energy demands of movement. In the stillness of the Paleozoic twilight, an orthocone did not swim so much as it drifted, a spectral needle hanging perfectly horizontal in the water column. The energy saved by this passive suspension was diverted into the development of a sophisticated nervous system and the growth of powerful, grasping tentacles. The siphuncle was the regulator of this equilibrium, a delicate interface where the chemistry of life met the physics of the void. If the pressure of the deep sought to implode the shell, the internal gas pressure provided a subtle, counteracting force, a balance of power maintained by the constant, unconscious labor of the siphuncle's cells. The gases trapped within these stone vaults were remnants of the animal's past breaths, a physical record of its journey from the sunlit shallows to the midnight zones. As the Cameroceras matured, it would seal off older chambers, abandoning the spaces of its youth to serve as permanent buoyancy tanks. There is a profound loneliness in this architecture creature, followed by the hollow ghosts of its own growth, carrying the weight of its history as the very tool that allows it to fly through the liquid dark. The siphuncle remained the only connection to these abandoned rooms, a tether of living warmth in a cold, mineralized tomb. This tube was susceptible to the same pressures that governed the sea, yet it functioned with a reliability that allowed these giants to dominate the oceans for millions of years, navigating the vertical wilderness with a grace that belied their terrifying proportions. We must consider the sheer mechanical stress placed upon these internal walls. Each septum had to be engineered to withstand the differential between the high-pressure exterior and the low-pressure interior, a feat of natural masonry that has rarely been equaled in the history of life. The siphuncle was the master of this domain, the silent conductor of a hydrostatic orchestra. It allowed the cephalopod to transcend the limitations of the seafloor, turning a heavy, cumbersome shell into a vessel of exploration. In the silence of the Ordovician night, the only sound was the faint, rhythmic pulse of the siphuncle working against the sea, a tiny biological defiance of the gravity that sought to claim everything. This was the true power of the nautiloid, the ability to command the void within in order to conquer the world without. In the Stygian gloom of the Ordovician water column, the Cameroceras existed not as a mindless drifter, but as a sentinel of the deep, a creature whose consciousness was filtered through a ring of powerful, sensitive tentacles. To envision this predator is to look into the architecture of a nightmare refined by the cold logic of evolution. From the leading edge of the living chamber, a cluster of muscular appendages emerged, swaying with a rhythmic serpentine grace in the saline current. These were not the suckered arms of a modern octopus, but rather a specialized array of tactile sensors and grasping tools, perhaps covered in a roughened, leathery skin designed to provide friction against the smooth, calcified carapaces of trilobites. Each tentacle was a dedicated organ of perception, capable of detecting the minute, low-frequency vibrations of a distant prey's movement, the frantic scuttle of a limb, or the gentle pulse of a gill. The movement of these appendages was governed by a sophisticated ring of ganglia, a primitive yet highly effective brain that processed a sensory world alien to our own. In the absence of light, the Cameroceras relied on a form of touch at a distance, sensing the displacement of water molecules as they washed over its sensory receptors. This was the tentacled shadow of presence that moved with a terrifying weightless silence through the indigo void. When a target was localized, the tentacles would flare, creating a cone of capture from which there was no escape. The sheer speed of a cephalopod strike, even in this primordial era, was a masterclass in hydraulic acceleration. Within the center of this writhing crown lay the beaker-sharp, parrot-like implement made of chitin and reinforced with minerals, capable of shearing through the thickest trilobite armor as if it were parchment. The anatomy of the hunt was a study in mechanical precision. As the tentacles drew the prey toward the mouth, the Cameroceras would use its radula, a tongue-like ribbon of teeth, to further process the meal before it entered the esophagus. There is a cold, indifferent efficiency to this biological process, a cycle of consumption that had remained unchanged for millions of years. The creature's eyes, likely large and dark to capture the final stray photons of the twilight zone, would have watched the struggle with a lidless, prehistoric stare. These eyes were among the most complex of their time, providing the depth perception necessary to navigate a three-dimensional liquid world. This was a predator that did not need to see its world to dominate it. It felt the ocean's pulse within its own flesh, a symbiotic connection between the hunter and the medium of its survival. To consider the Cameroceras in its hunting prime is to acknowledge the sheer vulnerability of the smaller organisms that shared its world. To a trilobite, the approach of the giant shell was not a sound, but a sudden, localized change in pressure, a thickening of the water that signaled the arrival of the apex. The tentacles would descend like the fingers of a ghost, plucking life from the seafloor and lifting it into the crushing embrace of the shell. As we drift alongside this ancient sovereign, we realize that the tentacles were the bridge between the rigid, unyielding stone of the shell and the soft, fluid reality of the hunt. They were the instruments of the animal's will, a manifestation of the predatory drive that has haunted the oceans since the first light faded. The shadow of the tentacles was the last thing many creatures of the Ordovician ever knew, a final, tactile encounter with the absolute power of the deep, beyond the vertical hunting grounds of the cephalopods. The Ordovician seafloor transitioned into a surreal, kinetic landscape, dominated by the crinoids, the sea lilies. So the uninitiated eye, these organisms appear as delicate, floral arrangements carved from pale stone. But they are, in truth, tenacious animals, echinoderms whose lineage has endured the rise and fall of countless empires. They existed in vast, submerged forests, their skeletal stems anchored into the soft carbonate ooze by root-like holdfasts. These stems were composed of thousands of individual calcite discs known as columns, stacked with the precision of a master mason. This modular anatomy allowed the crinoids to achieve a paradoxical state of being. They were rigid enough to withstand the tug of the primordial tides, yet flexible enough to sway in a hypnotic, synchronized dance that tracked the movement of the nutrient-rich currents. The flower of the crinoid, the calyx, sat atop this calcified stalk like a delicate crown, housing the creature's vital organs and protecting the central mouth. From this crown, a series of feathery, branching arms extended into the water column, creating a sophisticated biological net. These arms were lined with microscopic, flickering cilia and sticky tube feet that captured the marine snow, the constant, slow-motion drizzle of organic detritus falling from the sunlit layers above. There is a profound rhythmic patience to this existence. The crinoid forest did not hunt, it waited. It harvested the energy of the ocean's decay, turning the waste of the upper world into the structural beauty of the lower. The sound of this environment would have been a low-frequency clicking, the sound of the million tiny armored joints adjusting to the shifting weight of the water, a percussive backdrop to the eternal silence of the deep. In the indigo twilight, these crinoid meadows created a complex, three-dimensional habitat that supported a hidden world of smaller commensal organisms. Snails and trilobites navigated the vertical stalks, seeking refuge from the open-water predators within the limestone thicket. The crinoids themselves were a study in mineralized endurance, their bodies reinforced with high magnesium calcite, that shimmered with a dulled, stony luster. They were the silent witnesses to the gob. Their Desarfan, witnesses to the gob, their diversity mirroring the explosion of life across the planet. Some species developed long whip-like stems to reach the faster currents of the higher tiers, while others remained low and robust, hugging the seafloor where the pressure was greatest and the movement of the water was a heavy, predictable pulse. To look upon a forest of stone is to contemplate the intersection of biology and geology. When a crinoid died, its skeletal discs did not simply vanish. They became the very ground upon which the next generation would grow. Thick beds of crinoidal limestone, often several meters deep, represent the accumulated lives of trillions of individuals, a literal foundation of biological history. As the currents of the Ordovician Sea wash through these swaying arms, we are reminded that life does not always require the frantic energy of the chase. There is power in the persistence of the stationary, in the ability to stand firm against the crushing weight of the ages and simply wait for the world to provide. The crinoids were the keepers of the seafloor's rhythm, their stony swaying a metronome for a world that moved at the pace of the mountains. As the Ordovician progressed, the planet began to whisper of a coming cold, a slow and agonizing transformation of the global thermostat that would redefine the boundaries of the habitable world. The supercontinent of Gondwana, a colossal mass of crustal rock carrying the future lands of Africa, South America, and Antarctica, was drifting with an inexorable tectonic momentum toward the South Pole. This was not a sudden catastrophe, but a lingering shift in the Earth's thermal equilibrium. As the landmass occluded the pole, the warm equatorial currents that had once circulated freely were diverted, disrupted by the emerging geography of a changing world. The deep-sea temperatures began to plummet, creating a sharp thermocline boundary of density and cold that separated the familiar shallows from a new frigid abyss. This transition created a sensory landscape of increasing hostility and crystalline clarity. The water is heavy, quiet, and colder, grew more dense, more viscous, pressing against the gills of the trilobites with a new, heavy urgency. The chemistry of the ocean began to react to the falling temperatures. The rate of calcium carbonate precipitation slowed, making the construction of the giant shells a more metabolically expensive endeavor. In the high latitudes, the first permanent ice sheets began to nucleate upon the highlands of Gondwana, locking away the planet's moisture in a frozen terrestrial vault. This withdrawal of water caused the global sea levels to drop, exposing the vast, sun-drenched continental shelves, the very cradles of the Gobi too, the dry, oxygen-rich air for the first time in millions of years. The retreat was a slow-motion recession, a rhythmic pulling back of the tide that left behind dry lagoons and salt-crusted flats. The biological response to this Gondwana chill was one of desperate migration and specialized adaptation. Species that had flourished in the warm, stagnant seas of the early Ordovician found themselves trapped in a tightening thermal vise. The great orthocones, once the undisputed masters of a global tropical sea, were forced to follow the retreating warmth or adapt to the oxygen-rich, icy currents of the deepening basins. This was the birth of the psychrosphere, the cold layer of the deep ocean that characterizes our modern world. In this new, chilled environment, the metabolic rates of the inhabitants began to slow, their lives lengthening into a glacial rhythm. The very molecules of life moved more deliberately, reflecting the encroaching stillness of a world moving toward an ice age. There is a profound melancholic beauty in this continental drift, a reminder that the stage upon which life plays its part is itself a restless and indifferent actor. The mountains of Gondwana, rising under the pressure of plate collisions, began to shed their minerals into the cooling seas, fueling a final, frantic burst of productivity before the white silence of the glaciers took hold. To observe this era is to witness the closing of a door. The exuberant warmth of the early Ordovician was being traded for the stark, monochromatic efficiency of a frozen planet. As the shadows of the ice sheets lengthened across the southern horizon, the ocean prepared itself for a trial of endurance, a period where only the most resilient, the most flexible, and the most patient would survive the coming of the Great White Void. In the granular darkness of the seafloor, the trilobite Isotellus rex navigated a world not of color, but of geometric precision and vibration. To understand the perspective of this Ordovician wanderer, one must examine the most sophisticated optical system of the ancient world, the schizochroal eye. Unlike the soft, fluid-filled lenses of the human eye, the trilobite looked through a literal and mineralized window. Their eyes were composed of high-purity calcite crystals, an inorganic bridge between the biological and the geological. Each lens was a doublet, a complex arrangement of two different mineral layers designed by evolution to correct for spherical aberration underwater. This allowed the isotellus to maintain a perfectly focused image of its surroundings, even in the murky, silt-laden depths where the light was little more than a bruised memory of the surface. The visual field of these creatures was a mosaic of thousands of individual hexagonal facets, each acting as a dedicated light trap. This provided the trilobite with a nearly 360-degree panoramic view of the benthos, a wraparound awareness that made them masters of their immediate environment. They did not see the world as a fluid cinema, but as a high-contrast grid of movement and shadow. The slightest flicker of a cephalopod's tentacle or the subtle shift of a predatory eurypterid's claw would trigger a massive, instantaneous firing of the trilobite's subesophageal ganglion. This was a nervous system tuned to the frequency of survival, a biological radar that had been refined over 100 million years of evolutionary pressure. As Isotellus scuttled across the carbonate sands, its many-jointed limbs moved with a rhythmic, mechanical cadence, sensitive to the chemical whispers of the water. The anatomy of the trilobite body was a study in modular defense. The tripartite division, the cephalon, the thorax, and the pygidium, was covered in a thick, calcified cuticle that provided a rigid barrier against the hydraulic pressure of the deep. This armor was not static, it was a living, breathing interface with the world. Between the segments, soft, flexible membranes allowed the trilobite to enroll a defensive maneuver that turned the animal into an impenetrable ball of stone when threatened. Within this armored shell, the animal's respiratory system worked with a steady, unhurried pace. Their gills, located on the upper branches of their baramus limbs, acted as delicate feathery plumes that extracted oxygen from the increasingly cold currents of the late Ordovician. This was a life defined by the slow, grinding reality of the seafloor, an existence where the primary goal was to remain unnoticed and unbroken. To look into the faceted eye of a trilobite is to gaze upon a design that flourished for hundreds of millions of years before the concept of a mammal was even a biological possibility. These were the primary witnesses to the great changes of the Ordovician, their mineralized lenses recording the descent of the glaciers and the shifting of the continents. They represent a peak of invertebrate engineering, a testament to the idea that life, when given enough time, will turn even the stones of the earth into instruments of perception. As the isotellus fades back into the silt, we are left with the haunting realization that we are viewing the world through a lens of ancient crystalline glass, a perspective that is as cold, as sharp, and as enduring as the deep time that produced it. As the Ordovician world tilted toward its icy climax, the seafloor became the site of a quiet architectural revolution. The rise of the bryozoans and the hardening of the primordial reefs. These were the seeds of the Silurian transition, a biological movement that saw the transition from loose, skeletal mounds to the rigid, wave-resistant structures that would eventually dominate the tropics of the future. The bryozoans, often called moss animals, were colonial organisms of immense structural complexity. Individually, a bryozoan was almost microscopic, a delicate polyp housed in a calcified box known as a zooichium. But collectively they functioned as a singular, stony entity, weaving intricate lace-like fans and robust branching thickets that acted as the connective tissue of the seabed. They were the master weavers of the deep, binding the discarded shells of brachiopods and the fallen discs of crinoids into a permanent, calcified landscape. The growth of these colonies was a rhythmic, fractal expansion. Each new zooichium was a precise replica of the last, built with a chemical focus that turned the dissolved minerals of the cooling ocean into a fortress of stone. In the bruised indigo light of the deeper shells, these bryozoan thickets created a sanctuary for a burgeoning world of microlife. The water passing through their calcified lattices was filtered with a relentless mechanical precision. As millions of tiny ciliated tentacles, the lophors extended into the current to pluck organic particles from the flow. This was a world of microscopic efficiency, where the energy of the ocean was captured not by the swift or the strong, but by the patient and the communal. The sheer surface area provided by these branching colonies transformed the seafloor from a flat desert of silt into a three-dimensional metropolis of calcium. Beneath the living surface of the reef, the process of lithification was already underway. turning the biological successes of the present into the geological record of the future. The interstitial spaces between the bryozoan fans were filled with fine carbonate mud and the skeletal debris of the gobe, creating a dense, rock-like matrix. This hardening of the reef was a critical evolutionary milestone. It allowed life to build upward, challenging the currents and creating new high-energy environments where oxygen was plentiful and competition was fierce. These structures were the precursors to the Great Barrier Reefs of later eras, a structural ambition that had to survive the encroaching cold of the Hirnantian glaciation. The reefs were the anchors of the ecosystem, providing the stability necessary for life to endure the shifting chemistry of a dying era. To observe a bryozoan colony is to witness the power of the collective over the individual. There is no central mind here, only a shared genetic blueprint and a common purpose to grow, to endure, and to calcify. As the Ordovician seas cooled, these moss animals became the silent custodians of the ocean's mineral wealth, hoarding the calcium of the ages to build a world that would outlast the very mountains. They represent a bridge between the fluid and the firm, a reminder that the most enduring monuments of deep time are often built by the smallest hands. As we drift over these prehistoric thickets, we feel the weight of the coming transition, a sense that the world is hardening, preparing itself for the trial of ice that lies just beyond the horizon. The seeds of the future were being sown in the stony silence of the reef, in the profound isolation of the Ordovician basins. The primary architect of existence is not the sun nor the current, but the immense invisible weight of the water column. To exist at these depths is to live within a vice of liquid gravity, where every square inch of an organism's surface is subject to a constant inward pressure that defines the very limits of biological possibility. This is a world of high density and low compressibility, where the water behaves less like a fluid and more like a solid, unyielding embrace. For the creatures of the deep, hydrostatic pressure is the singular truth of their reality, a force that dictates the thickness of a shell, the elasticity of a membrane, and the very chemistry of their cellular metabolism. It is a silent, crushing indifference that has remained unchanged for 450 million years, a physical constant in a world of biological flux. The philosophy of the deep is one of total surrender to this weight. To fight the pressure is to be destroyed by it. Survival requires an internal equilibrium, a matching of the force within to the force within to the force without. We see this in the delicate, fluid-filled bodies of the soft tissues and the gas-regulated chambers of the cephalopods. The pressure acts as a biological filter, allowing only those with the most rigorous structural integrity or the most flexible physical grace to persist. In the indigo darkness, the weight of the sea provides a strange kind of stability, a world where there is no sudden impact, only the slow, rhythmic squeeze of the tides. The water column is a cathedral of kinetic energy, stored in the sheer mass of the liquid overhead, pressing down upon the benthos with a prehistoric authority that renders the surface world a trivial, weightless dream. The chemical implications of this pressure are equally profound. At these depths, the solubility of gases and minerals changes, affecting the rate at which a trilobite can harden its cuticle or a crinoid can precipitate its calcite discs. The very molecules of life must operate under a different set of rules, where the transition between liquid and solid is governed by the heavy hand of the abyss. This is the high-pressure laboratory of evolution, a place where the fundamental building blocks of vertebrates and invertebrates alike were tested against the ultimate stress. To move through this water is to push against the accumulated weight of the atmosphere multiplied 100-fold, a feat of locomotion that requires a metabolic patience beyond human comprehension. The silence here is not the absence of sound, but the presence of total, overwhelming mass. As we reflect on the weight of the eternal dark, we are forced to confront our own insignificance within the vertical scale of the planet. We are creatures of the interface, living at the very top of a column of water and gas that stretches down into the crushing depths of deep time. The Ordovician deep reminds us that the vast majority of our world is not designed for us. It is a realm of high-pressure sovereignty where life has flourished for eons in conditions that would reduce our bodies to a memory. There is a terrifying beauty in this realization, that beneath the thin sunlit veneer of our lives, the Earth remains a place of cold, heavy, and magnificent indifference. The water column is a bridge between the stars and the stone, a heavy, liquid history that continues to press down, silent and eternal, long after the giant shells have turned to dust. In the shivering transition of the late Ordovician, a new silhouette began to weave through the labyrinth of crinoid stalks, the first true vertebrates. These were the ostracoderms, represented by pioneers like Hirnantian, humble heralds of a lineage that would one day claim the land and the air. To look upon Hirnantian is to see the raw ancestral blueprint of the human form, stripped of limbs, jaws and a neck, reduced to the essential mechanics of a living arrow. This was a creature of the margins, barely 6 inches in length, moving with a rhythmic tadpole-like undulation through the cooling currents. It possessed no internal skeleton of bone. Instead, its body was encased in a heavy dorsal and ventral shield of dermal bonus suit of organic armor, pitted and textured like a weathered stone, designed to ward off the grasping tentacles of the cephalopod kings. The sensory world of Hirnantian was one of proximity and chemical intuition. Lacking a jaw, it was a suction feeder, a vacuum of the benthos that drifted inches above the sea floors, drawing in microscopic organic debris and soft-bodied larvae. Its mouth was a simple horizontal slit, an opening into a world of constant rhythmic filtration. The most striking feature of this early vertebrate was its lack of paired fins. It possessed no means of sophisticated navigation, moving instead by the sheer brute force of its muscular tail. This made the Hirnantian a creature of the current, a passenger of the tide that lived in a state of perpetual, heavy vulnerability. Yet, within its small, armoured head, it carried the most significant innovation of its age, a complex bilateral nervous system and a primitive lateral line system, a row of sensory pores that allowed it to feel the pressure waves of the ocean like a phantom touch. The anatomy of these jawless fish was a study in defensive specialization. The dermal plates were not just shields, but reservoirs of minerals, a biological bank of calcium and phosphate that could be drawn upon during periods of environmental stress. Beneath this armor, the gills were housed in a series of internal pouches, a sophisticated respiratory engine that allowed the fish to maintain its metabolic pace even as the Ordovician oceans began to lose their warmth. There is a profound, quiet dignity in the life of Hirnantian. It was the underdog of the Paleozoic, a soft-bodied hope protected by a crust of bone, surviving in the shadows of giants whose shells were 20 times its size. It represents the transition from the external strength of the invertebrate to the internal resilience of the vertebrate, a shift in the very philosophy of being. As we watch this small armored flicker disappear into the indigo murk, we are forced to reflect on the nature of beginnings. The Hirnantian did not know that it carried the genetic spark of every fish, amphibian, reptile and mammal that would ever exist. It was simply a creature of the dark, holding its place in the current, enduring the crushing weight of the water with a stoic, primitive persistence. The kingdom of the giant shells was a world of outward grandeur, but the future belonged to these small, jawless wanderers, the first to possess the internal spark that would eventually ignite the history of the world. In the cold, saline silence of the Ordovician, the vertebrate journey began not with a roar, but with a silent, armoured pulse in the mud. In the absolute depths of the Ordovician basins, where the final struggling photons of the sun are extinguished by a kilometre of brine, a different kind of light begins to flicker the spectral chemical fire of the first bioluminescent precursors. While the fossil record is famously silent on the soft tissues of light-producing organs, the laws of evolutionary biology and the extreme isolation of the late Ordovician deep suggest a world that was far from truly dark. In this lightless theatre, communication and predation were mediated by the cold glow of luciferin and luciferase, a metabolic byproduct turned into a weapon of survival. These were not the complex photophores of modern lanternfish, but likely primitive symbiotic bacterial blooms hosted within the mantles of cephalopods or the feathery plumes of deep-water graptolites. This was a liquid void punctuated by ghosts of neon blue and ghostly green, a silent, flickering conversation held in the language of photons. The sensory world of the deep-sea inhabitant was transformed by these chemical signals. For a predator like a deep-dwelling nautiloid, a faint, rhythmic pulse of light could serve as a lure, a will-o'-the-wisp, designed to draw in curious trilobites or smaller, soft-bodied invertebrates. Conversely, bioluminescence served as the first high-speed alarm system of the deep. A sudden, blinding flash of burglar alarm light could startle a hunter long enough for the prey to vanish into the surrounding ink. To exist in this environment was to be a master of contrast. The eyes of these creatures, often oversized and globular, were tuned to the specific narrowband frequencies of blue and green light that penetrate most effectively through the saline medium. They lived in a state of hyper-awareness, where a single spark in the distance could mean the difference between a meal and a quick, cold death. The mechanics of this light production were a triumph of metabolic economy. In a world where food was scarce and the pressure was immense, the luxury of generating light had to be balanced against the constant demand for oxygen and energy. Many organisms likely utilized extracellular luminescence, secreting glowing clouds of mucus to mask their escape or to create a decoy of their own silhouette. This was a world of smoke and mirrors played out in the indigo gloom, a theatre of shadows where the boundaries of an organism were often defined by the glow it cast. The chemistry of these early light producers was a byproduct of the increasing oxygenation of the deep oceans. As oxygen levels rose during the cooling of the globe, the oxidation of certain proteins became a viable pathway for a new luminous form of ecological competition. As we drift through this starlit abyss, we are reminded that the ocean is never truly empty, nor is the darkness ever truly absolute. The bioluminescent precursors of the Ordovician were the first to turn the void into a canvas, using the energy of life to defy the oppressive weight of the night. This cold, chemical light was the first step toward the complex visual ecosystems of the modern abyss, a reminder that even in the most hostile environments, life will find a way to manifest its presence. The flickering lights of the deep are the embers of a prehistoric fire, burning with a silent, indifferent beauty that has outlasted the continents themselves. To achieve this light is to see the very pulse of the planet's hidden heart, a rhythm of survival that continues to beat in the crushing eternal dark. In the middle layers of the water column, suspended between the turbulent surface and the silent benthos, lived the graptolites, perhaps the most enigmatic architects of the Ordovician deep. To the untrained eye, a fossilized graptolite resembles a pencil mark on stone or a stray, serrated blade of grass. But in the living ocean, they were complex, colonial organisms that drifted in rhythmic, geometric patterns. These were the megalograptus reefs of the open sea, not anchored to the earth, but tethered to the currents. Each blade or branch was actually a proteinaceous housing known as a rhabdosome, constructed from a collagen-like substance that was both incredibly light and remarkably durable. Within this structure lived hundreds of individual zooids, tiny, interconnected polyps that functioned as a singular, drifting mind. They were the wanderers of deep time, a colonial life form that treated the entire ocean as a three-dimensional lattice for expansion. The life of a graptolite colony was one of total communal synergy. Using delicate, feathery appendages, the zooids would beat in unison, creating minute vortices that drew nutrient-rich water through their feeding structures. This collective pulse allowed the colony to maintain its position in the water column, or slowly migrate toward areas of higher planktonic density. There is a haunting mechanical beauty to their movement, 1,000 tiny lives working as one, a living net cast into the prehistoric blue. Some colonies were branched like antlers, while others formed intricate spiral cages or long whip-like filaments that could reach several meters in length. They were the primary recorders of the Ordovician atmosphere. Because they drifted so freely, they remained settled into the deep-sea muds across the globe, creating a synchronized fossil record that allows us to map the pulse of the ancient world with surgical precision. The chemistry of the graptolite housing was a marvel of Paleozoic material science. The collagen-based skeleton was resistant to the high-sulfur environments of the deep basins, allowing these colonies to thrive where more delicate organisms would have withered. In the twilight zones, the megalograptus and its kin formed drifting reefs, massive aggregations of colonial life that provided shelter for larval trilobites and small ancestral cephalopods. These floating ecosystems were the first of their kind, a bionautical innovation that utilized the buoyancy of the water to escape the crowded competition of the seafloor. As they drifted, they cast long, serrated shadows against the indigo light, a rhythmic flickering that mirrored the slow, cyclical nature of the Ordovician tides. They were the metronomes of the open sea, their existence measured in the distance traveled by a global current. To reflect on the graptolite is to consider the power of the communal over the individual. There was no central heart, no singular brain, yet the colony moved with a purpose that surpassed the sum of its parts. They were the ghosts of the Paleozoic, organisms so successful that they dominated the world's oceans for over 100 million years, only to vanish, leaving behind nothing but silver-grey imprints on dark shale. Their legacy is one of silent persistence, a reminder that the most widespread and successful lives are often those that drift with the world rather than fighting against it. As we pass through these drifting forests of protein and bone, we feel the immense scale of the Ordovician Ocean, a place where life was not just a struggle on the mud, but a graceful, floating dance in the eternal dark. In the brackish shallows and the silt-heavy transition zones of the Ordovician coastlines, a new and terrifying silhouette began to claim the littoral frontier. These were the Eurypterids, the sea scorpions, and among them, the early genus Megalograptus, stood as a testament to the brutal efficiency of the arthropod blueprint. To observe a Eurypterid in motion is to witness the birth of a predatory legacy that would eventually find its way into the shadowed corners of our own modern world. They were armored in a thick, chitinous exoskeleton, a suit of biological plate mail that was both flexible and incredibly resilient. Their bodies were segmented, tapering into a powerful telson, or tail, that provided the propulsion necessary for sudden, explosive bursts of speed. But it was their forwardmost appendages that defined their role in the ancient sea. Massive spiked claws designed to snatch and impale anything that dared to move within the sediment. The transition of the Eurypterid from a minor benthic dweller to an apex predator of the shallows was driven by the shifting geography of the late Ordovician. As the sea levels began to fluctuate in response to the growing Gondwanan glaciers, vast areas of the continental shelf were transformed into tidal flats and estuaries. In these oxygen-rich, high-energy environments, the Eurypterid flourished. They were among the first to master the art of the scuttly, rhythmic, multi-limbed crawl that allowed them to navigate the interface between the water and the shore. Their sensory world was dominated by mechanoreceptors, tiny hairs on their limbs that could feel the frantic heartbeat of a buried bivalve or the subtle displacement of water caused by a passing trilobite. They were the silent reapers of the brackish dark, moving with a mechanical, clicking precision that echoed the harsh logic of the hunt. Anatomically, the Eurypterid was a marvel of Paleozoic engineering. Their respiratory system utilized book-gills, delicate, leaf-like structures protected by ventral plates that allowed them to extract oxygen with remarkable efficiency. This robust respiratory drive fueled a high metabolic lifestyle, allowing for the rapid muscle contractions needed to operate their heavy, spiked limbs. Unlike the slow-drifting orthocones, the Eurypterid was a creature of kinetic intent. To look into their simple and compound eyes was to see a mind entirely focused on the geometry of the kill. They represented the rise of the active predator, an organism that did not wait for the current to provide, but instead actively sought out and subdued its prey through superior force and specialized weaponry. As we watch the Megalograptus retreat into a forest of kelp-like algae, we are reminded of the inherent violence of deep time. The sea scorpions were the first to prove that the arthropod form could be scaled to terrifying proportions, a design so successful that it would endure for hundreds of millions of years. They were the pioneers of the shoreline, the gatekeepers of the transition between the abyss and the land. Their presence in the Ordovician was a warning that the ocean was no longer a place of passive filtration, but a theater of active and unrelenting competition. In the rhythmic clicking of their claws against the stones, we hear the distant ancestors of every predator that would eventually walk the earth, a legacy of bone and chitin forged in the shallows of a cooling world. The gigantism of the Ordovician titans was not an accident of fate, but a consequence of a profound atmospheric shift known as the oxygen pulse. To understand the scale of the Cameroceras or the robust carapaces of the Isotellus rex, one must look to the invisible chemistry of the air above the waves. During this era, the cooling of the planet and the massive burial of organic carbon in the deep-sea trenches triggered a sustained rise in global oxygen levels. This was a slow-motion infusion of energy, a chemical windfall that allowed for the development of larger, more complex bodies. In the cold, dense water of the late Ordovician, oxygen dissolved with a newfound efficiency, providing the fuel for metabolic processes that had previously been constrained by the thin, suffocating atmosphere of the Cambrian. It was as if the planet had suddenly taken a deep, revitalizing breath, and life responded by expanding into the newly available volume. The biological impact of this oxidation was felt most acutely in the circulatory and respiratory systems of the marine megafauna. For a cephalopod to grow to the length of a ship, it required a massive supply of oxygen to power its muscular mantle and its sophisticated nervous system. The oxygen pulse allowed for the evolution of more efficient gills and high-capacity blood pigments, such as hemocyanin, which carried oxygen through the body with the cold precision of an industrial coolant. This was the era where the constraints on size were lifted, allowing the giant shells to reach their maximum theoretical dimensions. The increased oxygen also fueled the hardening of thicker, more massive armor, as the metabolic cost of precipitating calcium carbonate became easier to bear. Size, in the Ordovician, was a manifestation of chemical abundance, a physical proof of the ocean's newfound vitality. This pulse of energy created a feedback loop of ecological complexity. Larger predators required more prey, which in turn drove the evolution of more sophisticated defensive strategies and higher reproductive rates. The entire food web was stretched upward, creating a world of extremes. We see the emergence of high-energy lifestyles, active hunters that could sustain high speeds for longer durations, and burrowers that could penetrate deeper into the anoxic muds of the seafloor. The oxygen acted as a lubricant for evolution, smoothing the transition between simple survival and dominant mastery. It was a time of biological extravagance, where the limits of the possible were being tested against a backdrop of increasing environmental stability. The heavy, rhythmic breathing of the sea was the sound of a world operating at peak capacity. As we contemplate the oxygen pulse, we recognize the fragile dependency of life upon the unseen. The giants of the Ordovician were tethered to the chemical composition of their world. They were the children of a specific atmospheric moment, a window of opportunity that would eventually close as the climate shifted toward the Hirnantian freeze. Their grandeur was a temporary gift of the air, a reminder that the size and shape of every living thing is dictated by the elements it consumes. The Cameroceras, for all its terrifying power, was a prisoner of the oxygen gradient, a creature whose very existence was a celebration of a planet in balance. In the silent indigo depths, the pulse of oxygen was the heartbeat of the era, a steady, life-giving rhythm that allowed the shadows to grow large and the shells to grow heavy. Beneath the drifting graptolites and the hunting grounds of the giants, the Ordovician seafloor was paved with a living mosaic of brachiopods. These were the humble architects of the benthos, creatures that looked like the bivalve mollusks of our modern world, but belonged to a distinct and ancient lineage. To look upon a brachiopod carpet is to see the sheer, staggering scale of Paleozoic abundance. Millions upon millions of these organisms lay shoulder to shoulder, their calcified valves forming an undulating, stony crust over the soft carbonate mud. Unlike the clams of today, which use a muscular foot to burrow, the brachiopod was an immobile anchor, tethered to the substrate by a fleshy, tough stalk known as a pedicle. They were the silent, sedentary witnesses to the ages, their lives measured not in movement, but in the persistent, rhythmic filtering of the cold, saline currents. The anatomy of the brachiopod was centered around the Lophore complex, horseshoe-shaped organ tucked deep within the protection of the shell. This organ was lined with thousands of microscopic, flickering cilia that created a constant, localized current, drawing a steady stream of water into the mantle cavity. As the water passed over the lophole, it acted as both a lung and a mouth, extracting oxygen and microscopic nutrients with an efficiency that allowed these creatures to thrive in the low-energy zones of the deep shelf. There is a profound mechanical rhythm to a brachiopod bed. In the indigo twilight, the opening and closing of a billion valves would have created a faint, percussive clicking, a sound like a distant rain hitting a stone roof. This was the heartbeat of the Ordovician seafloor, a collective biological pulse that sustained the entire ecosystem. The shells themselves were masterpieces of mineralized defense, composed of layers of calcite and chitinous protein that provided a formidable barrier against the crushing pressure and the prying claws of predators. Each shell was a unique record of the environment, its growth rings capturing the seasonal fluctuations of a cooling planet. In the late Ordovician, as the water chemistry shifted and the Gondwanan glaciers began to lock away the world's moisture, the brachiopods responded by thickening their armor. They became the primary contributors to the global carbon cycle, sequestering vast amounts of calcium carbonate into the crust of the Earth. When they died, their shells did not dissolve. They accumulated in massive lithified layers, forming the bedrock upon which all subsequent life would be built. They were the literal foundation of the world, a stony legacy that persists in the limestone cliffs of our modern era. To contemplate the brachiopod carpet is to reflect on the power of the stationary, In a world of giant wandering shells and scuttling sea scorpions, the brachiopod found strength in its stillness. It did not need to hunt. It simply waited for the ocean to bring the world to its doorstep. This strategy of passive endurance made them one of the most successful groups in the history of life, surviving through 5 mass extinctions with their fundamental design largely unchanged. As we drift over these endless fields of clicking stone, we are reminded that the story of the Earth is not just written by the swift and the powerful. It is written by the patient, the numerous, and the small, the silent trillions who, through the simple act of existing, turned the living sea into a monument of deep time. While the waters of the Ordovician were cooling, the terrestrial foundations of the planet were undergoing a violent, slow-motion upheaval known as the tectonic orogeny. This was the birth of the mountains, a period of tectonic collision where the Paleozoic Ocean began to close, driving a volcanic arc into the eastern margin of the North American craton. To the organisms in the deep, this was not a visual event, but a sensory one, a millions-year-long resonance of grinding rock and shifting gravity. The seafloor, once a stable plain of carbonate mud, began to tilt and buckle under the weight of the encroaching land masses. The tectonic vibrations would have been felt as a low-frequency hum, a deep-seated shuddering in the mantle that signaled the end of one geographic era and the beginning of another. The impact of this orogeny on the marine world was profound and transformative. As the mountains rose, they were immediately attacked by the elements, their jagged peaks stripped of minerals by the relentless Ordovician rains. This weathering process unleashed a massive influx of siliciclastic sediment, sand, silt, and clay into the clear, carbonate-rich seas. The water grew turbid, its chemistry shifting from the calcite sea of the early Ordovician toward a more clastic-dominated environment. For the filter feeders, like the crinoids and the brachiopods, this was a period of intense physiological stress. The fine silt threatened to clog their delicate lowfalls and ciliated arms, forcing a rapid evolutionary pivot toward forms that could tolerate the muddying of their world. The sea was becoming a more complex, more chaotic medium, a place where the clarity of the deep was replaced by the swirling debris of a rising continent. This influx of terrigenous nutrients, however, acted as a fertilizer for the GOB. The iron and phosphorus washed from the tectonic islands fueled massive blooms of phytoplankton, which in turn supported the burgeoning populations of graptolites and cephalopods. The mountains were feeding the ocean, even as they sought to displace it. We see the emergence of new, silt-tolerant communities, opportunistic species that could thrive in the deltaic plumes where the fresh water of mountain rivers met the saline pulse of the sea. The landscape of the deep was no longer a uniform indigo void. It was now a patchwork of environments, from the clear, distal basins to the murky, nutrient-rich shallows. This was the era of the clastic wedge, a geological footprint that would define the stratigraphy of the Appalachians for eternity. To reflect on the tectonic orogeny is to recognize the inseparable link between the solid earth and the fluid sea. The mountains did not just provide a backdrop for the story of life, they were the primary drivers of its evolution, altering the chemistry of the water and the topography of the benthos. As the peaks reached toward the ozone-heavy sky, the giant shells below were forced to adapt to a world that was literally eroding beneath them. The sound of the Ordovician was the sound of mountains being born and oceans being filled, a rhythmic tectonic labor that reminded all living things of their insignificance in the face of planetary change. The Earth was moving, and the deep was its witness, a silent recorder of the violence required to build a world. The transition into the late Ordovician was marked by a chilling descent into the first pulse of the Hirnantian extinction, a catastrophe born not of fire, but of an insatiable creeping cold. This was the moment the great Ordovician biodiversification event met the immovable wall of planetary physics. As the glaciers on the southern supercontinent of Gondwana reached a critical mass, they began to exert a gravitational and thermal pull on the entire global climate system. The first stage of the extinction was defined by a rapid, dramatic retreat of the sea. Because the Earth's water was being locked away in continental ice sheets 3 kilometers thick, the global sea level plummeted by nearly 100 meters in a geological heartbeat. For the vast, teeming communities that lived on the sun-drenched continental shelves, this was the end of their world, not a sudden flood, but a slow, agonizing exposure to the thin, toxic air. The sensory experience of this stage was one of increasing salinity and shrinking horizons. In the shallow epicontinental seas where the giant shells had once reigned, the water became thick with minerals, its chemistry shifting as the volume of the sea decreased. The great carbonate platforms built over millions of years by the patient labor of brachiopods and bryozoans were suddenly thrust into the atmosphere, becoming desolate, salt-encrusted plains. The vibrant forests of crinoids were stranded in drying lagoons, their delicate calcite stalks collapsing under their own weight without the buoyancy of the water to support them. In the deeper basins, the sound of the ocean changed. The rhythmic pulse of the tides grew more concentrated, more violent, as the retreating water squeezed through narrower straits and shallower basins. Biologically, the first pulse of the extinction acted as a taxonomic scythe. Species that were specialized for the stable, warm shallows found themselves with nowhere to go. The Cameroceras and other megacephalopods, once the unchallenged apex predators, were forced into deeper, colder, and more competitive waters, where their massive size became a metabolic liability rather than an advantage. This was a period of forced migration, a desperate scramble for the shrinking habitable zone that existed between the advancing ice of the south and the deoxygenated depths of the equator. The vertical tiering of the ocean, which had become so sophisticated during the Gobe, began to collapse as the layers of the sea were compressed. The predator and the prey were pushed together into a tightening vice. A struggle for existence played out in a world that was literally vanishing beneath them. To reflect on this first pulse is to understand the fragility of abundance. The Ordovician Sea had been a masterpiece of biological complexity, yet it was tethered to a climate that was fundamentally unstable. The very success of the Gobe, a massive sequestration of carbon by trillions of shells, may have contributed to the cooling, as the reduction of greenhouse gases allowed the glaciers to take hold. Life had, in a sense, engineered its own crisis. As the last of the shallow water reefs were bleached by the sun and ground into dust by the wind, the ocean began to feel like a graveyard. The light was fading, the water was receding, and the great white silence of the south was beginning its long, northward march. The era of the giant shells was ending, and the era of the ice was about to begin. The encroachment of the ice was not a sudden event, but a slow, atmospheric thrumming, a transition from a world of liquid motion to one of crystalline stasis. As the Hirnantian age took hold, the southern horizon of Gondwana was dominated by the terrifying majesty of the continental ice sheets. These were not mere glaciers, but mountains of frozen water, 3 kilometers high, grinding the ancient crust into a fine, mineral dust. The sound of this world was the sound of pressure. The tectonic groan of the land sinking under the weight of the ice, and the sharp, rhythmic crack of the calving margins. As the glaciers advanced, they acted as a global heat sink, drawing the thermal energy from the atmosphere and the oceans alike. The temperate seas of the mid-latitudes, once the domain of thriving trilobite nurseries, began to freeze over, creating a jagged white landscape that reflected the dying light of the sun back into space. Beneath the growing ice shells, the sensory world of the deep ocean became one of monochromatic indigo and profound chill. The water temperature dropped toward the freezing point, increasing the viscosity of the sea until every movement felt like a struggle against a heavy, saline gel. For the inhabitants of the late Ordovician, this was a physiological crisis of the highest order. The metabolic pathways of the cold-blooded, the cephalopods, the arthropods and the brachiopods began to stutter and slow. The giant shells that had defined the era were now prisoners of their own mass, unable to generate the heat or energy required to maintain their dominance in a world that had lost its warmth. The ocean was becoming a laboratory of survival, where the only prize was the ability to endure the long white night. The chemistry of the ocean under the ice was a reflection of this environmental lockdown. As the glaciers covered the land, the influx of fresh water and silicate minerals from terrestrial weathering was cut off, replaced by a slow, concentrated brine. The oxygen levels in the deep basins, which had been so high during the Joy-B, began to fluctuate wildly as the global circulation patterns were disrupted. In the high latitudes, the water was so cold and dense that it sank rapidly, carrying oxygen to the abyss, but also creating a stark, vertical stratification that isolated the various layers of the sea. It was a world of islands of life, separated by vast freezing deserts of water where the nutrients had been depleted and the light could no longer reach. The silence was absolute. a heavy hydraulic quiet that seemed to press the very life out of the benthos. To contemplate the glacial encroachment is to witness the Earth in its most indifferent state. The ice did not care for the complexity of the reefs or the majesty of the orthocones. It was a physical response to the shifting of the stars and the movement of the crust. The Ordovician deep was being compressed into a narrow, frigid band of survival, a thin sliver of liquid between the frozen sky and the anoxic mud. As the white silence of the south moved ever closer to the equator, we are reminded that the history of life is often a history of retreat. We see the final desperate stands of once great lineages, huddling in the few remaining pockets of warmth, while the planet above them turned into a cold, glittering diamond. The age of the ice had arrived, and it would not leave until the world had been remade in its image. In the final stages of the Hirnantian collapse, the ocean faced a paradox of plenty that became a sentence of death. As the glaciers reached their maximum extent and began a series of fitful, climate-driven retreats, the sudden influx of meltwater and nutrients triggered a catastrophic phenomenon known as deep anoxia. This was the second pulse of the extinction, a suffocating silence that rose from the abyss like a ghost. The surface waters, fueled by the mineral wealth of the grinding ice, exploded with sudden opportunistic plankton blooms. But as these trillions of organisms died and sank into the depths, their decomposition consumed every available molecule of oxygen. The deep basins, once revitalized by the cold currents of the Gobe, were now transformed into stagnant, oxygen-starved tombs. The vital connection between the atmosphere and the benthos was severed, leaving the inhabitants of the deep to drown in a liquid void. The sensory transition into anoxia was a slow, creeping horror. For the great cephalopods, the first sign was a subtle, metallic change in the water's chemistry, a rise in hydrogen sulfide that acted as a chemical shroud. The gills of the Cameroceras, designed for high oxygen efficiency, began to struggle, their rhythmic pulsing growing frantic and shallow as they tried to extract life from a medium that had turned toxic. In the indigo dark, the behavior of the animals changed. The active predators became lethargic, their massive bodies sinking into the silt as their metabolic fires flickered out. The trilobites, usually the resilient survivors of the seafloor, found themselves trapped in a rising tide of black, sulfurous mud that seeped into their respiratory chambers. This was not a world of violent struggle, but of a heavy, airless exhaustion. The chemistry of the anoxic deep was a return to the primitive conditions of the early Earth. Without oxygen to mediate the breakdown of organic matter, the sulfur-reducing bacteria took control, releasing a faint, rotten egg stench that permeated the brine. The water grew dark, not just from the lack of light, but from the accumulation of suspended organic snow that would eventually form the black shales of the Silurian. This was a biological lockout. The vertical tiering of the ocean, the complex skyscrapers of life we explored earlier, was flattened into a single thin layer of survival near the surface. Everything below that narrow, oxygenated ceiling was reclaimed by the silence. The vast meadows of crinoids and the intricate bryozoan thickets were smothered under a blanket of anaerobic rot, their calcified skeletons dissolved by the shifting acidity of the breathless sea. To contemplate the deep anoxia is to witness the ultimate vulnerability of life to its own environment. The very nutrients that fueled the explosion of the Gobe became the agents of its destruction when the global circulation stalled. We are reminded that the ocean is a living, breathing lung, and when that lung ceases to expand, the world falls silent. As we drift through the lightless, airless basins of the late Ordovician, we see the true cost of the Ice Ager world, where the giants were brought low not by a predator, but by the simple absence of a gas. The era of the giant shells was suffocated by the weight of its own success, leaving behind a sea of shadows and a legacy of stone. In the wake of the twin pulses of cold and suffocation, the once vast architectural wonders of the Ordovician were reduced to the remnant reef's fragile, isolated citadels of biological resilience. These were the skeletal outposts of a world in transition, where the exuberant diversity of the Gobe had been winnowed down to a few hardy lineages of rugose and tabulate corals alongside the indomitable sponges. To observe these remnants in the late Hirnantian is to see a landscape of stark, calcified endurance. The reefs were no longer the sprawling metropolises of the tropical Golden Age. They were huddled clusters of life, clinging to the few remaining sunlit shallows where the water was still clear enough for photosynthesis and rich enough in oxygen to sustain a heartbeat. The sound here was a thin, lonely resonance, the ghost of a once crowded symphony, now reduced to the rhythmic kicking of a few surviving brachiopods against the stony ribs of the coral. The anatomy of these survivors was defined by a rugged, almost defensive simplicity. The tabulate corals formed dense, honeycomb-like structures, their individual polyps interconnected by horizontal plates called tabulae. This modular design allowed the colony to sacrifice individual sections to the encroaching silt or the plummeting temperatures, while the collective lived on. The rugose corals, or horn corals, stood like solitary, wrinkled sentinels in the mud, their deep, cup-like calyxes providing a refuge for the soft tissues of the polyp. These organisms were the masters of low metabolic persistence. They could wait out the long, dark intervals of the Ice Age. Their biological clocks slowed to a neostasis, existing on the meager offerings of a depleted ocean. They were the anchors of the ecosystem, providing the only structural complexity left in a world that had been flattened by the glaciers. Beneath the living veneer of these corals, the sponges, the phylum Porifera, maintained a silent prehistoric vigil. Having survived the rise and fall of countless eras before the Ordovician, the sponges were uniquely equipped for the catastrophe. Their skeletons of glass-like silica, or tough spongin, were indifferent to the shifting acidity and oxygen fluctuations that had decimated the more complex cephalopods. They acted as the ocean's ultimate janitors, filtering the bacteria-rich water of the anoxic transition and turning the debris of a dying world into new, living tissue. In the indigo gloom, the sponges stood as amorphous spectral shapes, their porous bodies vibrating with the invisible flow of the currents. They were the bridge between the old world and the new, a testament to the idea that in the theatre of deep time, the most primitive designs are often the most permanent. To contemplate the remnant reefs is to reflect on the nature of a bottleneck in the history of life. Every creature that would eventually populate the Silurian and Devonian oceans had to pass through this narrow gate of survival. The reefs were the genetic vaults of the planet, holding the blueprints for a recovery that was still millions of years away. As we drift over these lonely thickets of horn, coral and glass sponges, we feel the immense weight of the responsibility they carry. They are the last flickers of light in a darkening room, the stubborn embers of a fire that refuse to be extinguished by the ice or the dark. The Ordovician was fading, but in these quiet, stony sanctuaries, the heartbeat of the world continued to pulse, slow and steady, waiting for the return of the sun. The Hirnantian age represents the absolute nadir of the Ordovician journey, a cold, monochromatic climax where the planet's pulse slowed to a glacial rhythm. At this moment in deep time, the Earth was a study in stark, contrasting blues and blinding whites. The southern supercontinent of Gondwana was entirely occluded by a massive continental ice cap, a frozen shield that altered the gravity and the rotation of the world. The atmosphere, stripped of much of its moisture, was crystalline and thin, and the smell of the world was one of sterile, ozone-heavy cold. In the oceans, the Hirnantian was a period of extreme compression. The habitable space for marine life had been squeezed into a narrow equatorial belt, a thin ribbon of liquid survival that stood as the only defiance against a global freeze. To exist in the Hirnantian Sea was to inhabit a realm of high-density brine and crystalline clarity. As the temperature of the water plummeted, its ability to hold dissolved oxygen increased, but this was a cruel irony for the inhabitants. The cold was so intense that it inhibited the very metabolic processes required to use that oxygen. We see a world of biological stasis. The trilobites that remained, such as the hardy Mucronaspis, were smaller, their forms streamlined for a life of meager resources and slow movement. Their calcified carapaces were often thicker, providing better insulation and protection against the shifting, abrasive silts of the glacial runoff. The sensory world was dominated by the sound of the isoconstant, low-frequency groaning, and the occasional thunderous crack of an ice shelf collapsing into the sea, sending a shockwave through the water that could be felt for 1,000 miles. The chemistry of the Hirnantian was defined by a massive positive carbon isotope excursion, a geochemical signature of the profound disruption of the carbon cycle. With so much organic matter buried in the anoxic muds and so much water locked in the ice, the very breath of the planet had changed. The oceans were becoming increasingly saline as the freshwater was removed, creating a heavy viscous medium that required immense osmotic pressure for organisms to regulate. In this environment, the giant shells reached the end of their evolutionary rope. The energy required to maintain a 10-meter-long orthocone in near-freezing, hypercyan water was simply too great. The titans began to fade, their empty shells sinking into the frigid silt to be claimed by the slow, grinding movement of the deep-sea currents. To contemplate the Hirnantian is to witness the ultimate resilience of life. Despite the loss of 85% of marine species, the spark of existence was not extinguished. It was a period of forced simplification, a biological reset that cleared the stage for the next great act of Earth's history. The survivors were those who could thrive in the margins, the generalists, the small, and the patient. As we drift through this frozen indigo twilight, we realize that we are seeing the world at its most vulnerable, yet its most enduring. The Ice Age was a trial by fire in a world of frost, a crucible that refined the blueprints of life into their most efficient and resilient forms. The Hirnantian was the dark before the dawn, a long white silence that would eventually break, but only after the world had been thoroughly and irreversibly changed. The chemistry of the giant shell is a story of mineralized ambition, a complex synthesis of seawater and biology that turned the soft pulse of a cephalopod into a monument of stone. To understand the Cameroceras, one must look past the predatory tentacles and into the microscopic lattice of its armor. The shell was primarily composed of aragonite, a crystalline form of calcium carbonate arranged in a sophisticated staggered architecture. Unlike a simple rock, the shell was built layer by layer, a rhythmic deposition of mineral plates bonded by a thin, elastic matrix of conchoidal proteins. This composite structure was the secret to its endurance. It allowed the shell to be simultaneously hard enough to resist the crushing hydrostatic pressure of the deep and flexible enough to absorb the impact of a rival strike without shattering. At a molecular level, the construction of the shell was an intensive metabolic labor. The animal's mantle, the soft, fleshy organ that draped over the body, functioned as a biological foundry. It maintained a specialized extrapallial space, a thin film of fluid where the creature meticulously controlled the concentration of calcium and carbonate ions. By manipulating the pH and the protein signaling within this microenvironment, the nautiloid forced the minerals out of solution, weaving them into the growing edge of the shell. In the late Ordovician, as the global oceans cooled, this process became a struggle against thermodynamics. Colder water holds more dissolved carbon dioxide, increasing the acidity and making it harder for life to precipitate carbonate. The giant shells were effectively fighting the chemistry of their own world, burning precious energy to maintain the integrity of their homes as the environment turned against them. The shell was also a chemical diary of the ocean's history. As the aragonite was deposited, it trapped trace elements and isotopes from the surrounding water: strontium, magnesium, and oxygen-18. Each millimeter of the shell recorded the temperature of the sea, the salinity of the basin, and the proximity of the glaciers. For the Cameroceras, the shell was not just a shield, it was a heavy, persistent memory of every current it had ever swum through. The internal septa, the walls that divided the buoyancy chambers, were reinforced with a nacreous luster, a mother-of-pearl finish that provided maximum strength with minimum weight. This internal masonry was perhaps the most critical component of the nautiloid's survival, a series of pressurized bulkheads that allowed it to inhabit the vertical frontier, where the weight of the water was a constant, inward scream. As we reflect on the chemistry of the shell, we are reminded that life is an architect of the Earth's crust. The mountains of limestone that define our modern landscapes are often nothing more than the accumulated chemical labor of these ancient cephalopods. The aragonite, once part of a living, breathing hunter, has been transformed by deep time into the silent, cold bedrock of the continents. To look at a fossilized orthocone is to see the intersection of biology and geology, a moment where the fleeting spark of life was captured and preserved in the permanence of mineral. The giant shells were the first great masterpieces of oceanic chemistry, a testament to the power of a living organism to take the chaotic atoms of the sea and forge them into a legacy of stone. As the Hirnantian freeze tightened its grip on the planet, the great orthocones, the undisputed sovereigns of the Ordovician, began to flicker out like dying stars. To track the final images of the Cameroceras and its kin is to witness a slow biological retreat from the pinnacle of predatory dominance. These titans, once stretching 10 meters through the tropical blue, were being systematically dismantled by the shift in physics of their world. The giants did not vanish in a single catastrophic moment. Instead, they became the ghosts of their own era, their populations fragmenting into isolated refugia, where the water remained just warm enough and the oxygen just plentiful enough to sustain their massive metabolic demands. Their size, which had been their greatest asset during the oxygen pulse, was now a mounting debt they could no longer repay in a nutrient-poor, freezing sea. The phantom presence of these last giants was felt in the deepening basins, where the final generations of the great nautiloids drifted through the indigo dark. Evolution began to favor the small and the coiled. While the straight-shelled orthocones struggled with the mechanical leverage required to maneuver their immense lengths in a cooling, viscous ocean, their smaller cousins were experimenting with more compact, buoyant geometries. The ghost of Cameroceras lived on in the shrinking diameter of the shell and the increasing complexity of the internal sutures. The grand, spear-like forms were being traded for efficiency. In the fossil record, we see the shells becoming shorter, the septa more closely spaced, a physical manifestation of a lineage bracing for impact. The majesty of the giant shells was being hollowed out by the necessity of survival, leaving behind a spectral trail of calcified remnants in the Hirnantian mud. Anatomically, the decline was marked by a loss of specialized niches. The great apex predators were the first to suffer when the food webs of the globe collapsed. As the meadows of crinoids and the carpets of brachiopods withered under the glacial silt, the energy required to hunt vanished. The last of the Cameroceras likely became scavengers, their powerful tentacles picking through the debris of a dying world, their dark, globular eyes searching for the faint bioluminescence of a dwindling prey. There is a profound melancholy in the image of the last titan, a creature that had known an ocean of infinite warmth and abundance, now suspended in a silent, freezing void, the lone survivor of a dynasty of stone. Its shell, scarred by time and pitted by the increasingly acidic brine, was no longer a symbol of power, but a heavy, dragging anchor. When the last of the truly giant orthocones finally succumbed, their shells did not merely disappear, they became the foundations of the Silurian world. As these massive cylinders of aragonite settled into the anoxic black muds, they created localized rift environments for the microscopic survivors of the extinction. The ghost of the giant shell persisted in the very topography of the seafloor, a mineralized memory of a time when the earth belonged to the armored and the slow. The era of the straight-shelled titans had ended, giving way to the nimble, the jawed and the coiled, but in the rhythmic pulse of the modern nautilus and the complex brains of the squid, the legacy of the Ordovician giants endures a spectral resonance of a time when life first dared to grow large in the crushing eternal dark. The long, white silence of the Hirnantian began to fracture, not with a roar, but with a subtle, thermal quickening, a shift in the Earth's orbital tilt that signaled the return of the sun's dominion. The glaciers of Gondwana, once seemingly eternal, began to weep. This was the Great Thaw, a planetary-scale release of kinetic and chemical energy that transformed the oceans once more. As the ice retreated, it surrendered the vast quantities of fresh water and mineral wealth it had hoarded for millions of years. This influx of meltwater created a global freshwater lens that floated atop the heavy saline brine of the deep, temporarily disrupting the circulation of the world. But as the thermal equilibrium stabilized, the sea levels rose with a rhythmic, inexorable pace, reclaiming the barren, salt-encrusted continental shelves and drowning the scars of the Ice Age in a warm, turquoise embrace. The sensory transition of this rebirth was defined by the sound of moving water. The stagnant, anoxic basins were flushed by new, vigorous currents as the global conveyor belt of ocean circulation restarted. The water, once thick with a metallic tang of hydrogen sulfide, grew clear and oxygen-rich once more. In the shallows, the smell of life returned, the scent of blooming phytoplankton and the chemical signals of a billion regenerating larvae. For the survivors of the Ordovician collapse, the return of the warmth was a moment of frantic biological opportunity. The metabolic pace of the ocean accelerated. The cold-blooded inhabitants felt the rise in temperature as a surge of vitality, a restoration of the energy required to grow, to hunt, and to build. The world was no longer a monochromatic desert of ice. It was a vibrant, expanding theater of potential. However, the rebirth was not a return to the status quo. The world that emerged from the thaw was fundamentally different from the one that had entered the freeze. The giant shells were gone, their niches left vacant for a new generation of innovators. We see the rise of the early Silurian reef builders, moving with a faster, more aggressive growth rate than their predecessors. The chemistry of the sea had been reset, and the survivors were those who had learned the lessons of the dark. The brachiopods and crinoids began to recolonize the newly flooded plains, but they did so alongside more mobile and jawed competitors. The Great Thaw was a biological filter that had removed the cumbersome and the specialized, leaving behind a lean, resilient core of generalists, ready to rewrite the rules of existence. To contemplate the return of the warmth is to recognize the cyclic nature of deep time. The Earth breathes in ice and exhales in steam, a rhythmic oscillation that has dictated the tempo of evolution since the beginning. The Ordovician was the first great test of the modern marine ecosystem, a trial that proved life could be broken, compressed, and nearly extinguished, yet still retain the spark of recovery. As the last of the Hirnantian bergs melted into the rising tide, we are reminded that every ending is a prologue. The stones of the Ordovician were being buried under the silts of the Silurian, creating a new foundation for a world of fish, of forests, and eventually of us. The sun had returned, and with it, the promise of a new and different kind of majesty. The legacy of the Ordovician is not a silent collection of dust and debris, but a living resonance that hums within the genetic code of every complex organism on the planet. To look upon the modern ocean is to see the distorted, evolved echo of a world that was mastered by the giant shells 450 million years ago. This era was the crucible of the body plan, a time when the fundamental mechanics of bilateral symmetry, centralized nervous systems, and mineralized support were tested against the most extreme pressures the Earth could provide. The echo of the deep is found in the way our own bones sequester calcium, a metabolic trick refined by the brachiopods and the ostracoderms to turn the minerals of a cooling sea into a fortress of permanence. We carry the Ordovician within us, a skeletal memory of a time when the only way to survive the weight of the dark was to become as enduring as the stone. In the indigo silence of the present-day abyss, the echoes are more than metaphorical. The sophisticated buoyancy of the modern Nautilus is a direct, miniaturized inheritance from the Cameroceras, a lineage that learned to play the physics of the water column like a musical instrument. The faceted eyes of modern crustaceans and the complex, grasping intelligence of the octopus are refinements of strategies that were already reaching their apex in the Paleozoic twilight. The Ordovician taught life how to be three-dimensional, how to leave the safety of the mud and conquer the vertical wilderness. Every time a creature rises through the thermocline or hunts in the lightless zones, it is repeating a choreography that was first written in the saline syrup of the Gobe. The deep has a long memory, and it preserves the successes of the past with a cold, hydraulic fidelity. Furthermore, the Ordovician echo is written in the very chemistry of the world's atmosphere and soil. The massive sequestration of carbon by the trilobites and the reef builders created the limestone pulses that regulate our modern climate, acting as a geological thermostat that has prevented the Earth from spiraling into permanent heat or permanent frost. The mountains that were born during the tectonic orogeny have since been ground into the fertile silts of our river valleys, feeding the crops that sustain our civilization. We are literally built from the erosion of an Ordovician world, eating the dust of ancient peaks and breathing the oxygen that was first liberated during the great pulses of the Paleozoic. The link between that alien sea and our familiar land is a continuous, unbroken thread of chemical transformation. To reflect on the echo of the deep is to realize that no era ever truly ends. It merely changes state. The giants are gone, their shells dissolved into the bedrock, but the momentum they generated continues to propel the history of life forward. We are the inheritors of their endurance, the witnesses to a biological ambition that refused to be crushed by the weight of the water or the silence of the ice. As we listen to the rhythmic pulse of the tides, we are hearing the heartbeat of the Ordovician, a slow tectonic reminder that we are part of a much larger, much older story. The deep time that produced the giant shells is the same time that produces us, a single, flowing current that carries the spark of life from the prehistoric night into the uncertain dawn. The transition from a living organism to a geological artifact is a process of infinite patience known as the fossilization of time. When a titan like Cameroceras finally succumbed to the Hirnantian chill, its massive aragonite shell did not simply vanish into the currents. It began a slow, terminal descent toward the benthic graveyard. As it settled into the fine carbonate ooze, the weight of the water column acted as a relentless hydraulic press, driving the soft, limy silt into every empty buoyancy chamber, an abandoned septal void. This was the beginning of permineralization, the molecular replacement of biology with geology. Over millions of years, the mineral-rich pore waters of the deep crust seeped through the porous shell, slowly exchanging the unstable aragonite for more durable calcite or even silica, turning the creature's history into a literal casting of stone. The sensory reality of fossilization is one of absolute suffocating stillness. Within the burial layer, the rhythmic pulse of the ocean is replaced by the agonizingly slow movement of ions and the steady tectonic increase in pressure. The shell, once a vessel of movement and intent, becomes a structural part of the Earth's crust. In the anoxic basins of the late Ordovician, this process was often aided by the lack of scavengers and oxygen, allowing for the preservation of exquisite details. The delicate growth rings of the shell, the subtle sutures of the septa, and occasionally, the ghostly impressions of soft tissues. The fossils are not merely remains, they are snapshots of a chemical moment, frozen by the weight of the ages. The very silt that once threatened to clog the gills of the trilobite now serves as the protective medium that ensures its immortality. As the layers of sediment accumulated, the Ordovician world was buried under kilometers of subsequent history. The Silurian muds, the Devonian sands in the Carboniferous forests, the heat and pressure of the Earth's interior began to bake these layers, turning the loose sediment into the hard limestones and shales that form the bedrock of our modern continents. This is the lithification of an era. The giant shells became inclusions within the stone, their forms preserved as hollow molds or solid casts that wait in the dark for the random violence of erosion or the curious hand of a human. To hold a fossil is to hold a piece of the Ordovician atmosphere, a physical manifestation of a time when the Earth's pulse was different, its chemistry more primal, and its oceans more vast. To contemplate the fossilization of time is to recognize the ultimate triumph of the mineral over the flesh. Everything that was once soft, vibrant, and filled with the frantic energy of survival has been traded for the cold permanence of the crystal. The giants have been turned into the foundation of our world, their lives supporting the very ground we walk upon. This process is the planet's way of remembering itself, a slow-motion recording of every success and every failure that occurred in the indigo twilight. As we look upon these stony relics, we see the end of the journey, a transition from the fluid to the firm, and a final surrender to the deep time that claims all things. The giant shells have become the Earth, and in doing so they have achieved a immortality that the living can only imagine. To stand on the shores of a modern ocean and look out toward the horizon is to participate in a profound biological delusion. We see a world that appears finished, a stable and permanent stage designed for the human drama. Yet the Ordovician deep reminds us that we are merely the latest tenants in a vast liquid skyscraper. Our perspective is limited by the brevity of our shadows. The entire span of human history, from the first charcoal mark on a cave wall to the launch of a satellite, is a mere heartbeat compared to the duration of a single brachiopod lineage. To the Cameroceras, drifting in its indigo cathedral for millions of years, the rise of man would be an imperceptible flicker, a momentary disturbance in the oxygen gradient of a planet that has seen empires of stone rise and fall long before the first mammal drew breath. This realization brings with it a heavy, meditative humility. We are accustomed to being the protagonists of the Earth, yet in the context of deep time, we are an afterthought, a specialized and perhaps fragile experiment in consciousness occurring in the final seconds of the planetary day. The Ordovician was a world of absolute alien majesty that functioned perfectly for 45 million years without the gaze of a human eye or the touch of a human hand. It was a kingdom of giants that required no witness to be magnificent. When we study the kingdom of the giant shells, we are not just looking at fossils, we are looking at the indifference of the universe. The pressure of the deep, the chemistry of the shell, and the rhythmic advance of the glaciers operated according to laws that do not acknowledge our presence. This indifference is not cruel. It is simply the scale of the sublime. There is, however, a strange comfort to be found at our insignificance. To know that the Earth has survived the collapse of the Gobi, the suffocating depths of anoxia, and the white silence of the Hirnantian is to know that life is an unstoppable force. We are part of a biological momentum that has been refined in the most punishing crucibles imaginable. The fact that we can even contemplate the Cameroceras, that we can reconstruct its nervous system and calculate its buoyancy, is a testament to the continuity of the spark. We are the universe's way of looking back at its own ancient submerged self. The giant shells are not just relics of a dead world, they are the ancestors of our own resilience, the providers of the limestone that builds our cities and the carbon that fuels our heat. As we close the distance between our time and theirs, the boundaries of the self begin to dissolve. We realize that the water in our blood once washed over the gills of the Ordovician, and the calcium in our teeth was once dissolved in the brine of a Paleozoic sea. To acknowledge the Ordovician is to accept our place in a grand, rhythmic procession of form and function. We are a brief vocal interval in a long, silent symphony of stone. In the shadow of the giant shells, our anxieties feel smaller, our struggles more quiet, and our connection to the planet more profound. We are the witnesses of deep time, the temporary keepers of a story that began in the eternal dark and will continue long after our own shells have been reclaimed by the silt. In the final hours of the Ordovician, before the return of the sun, the ocean was governed by the eternal current, a slow, rhythmic movement of water that served as the planet's primary circulatory system. To understand the deep is to understand this motion, a silent, invisible river that flows without the aid of wind or tide, driven entirely by the heavy hand of thermodynamics. This is the thermohaline circulation of the ancient sea, where the cold, salt-laden waters of the southern glaciers sank with a majestic hydraulic momentum, pushing toward the equator in a cycle that took centuries to complete a single revolution. For the creatures of the dark, this current was the only measure of time. It was a constant, predictable pressure against the shell, a reliable delivery of oxygen and minerals that allowed the giants to persist in a world where the sun was merely a myth. The sensory experience of the eternal current is one of absolute, hypnotic repetition. As we drift within this liquid conveyor, the movement feels less like travel and more like a state of being. There is no turbulence here, no sudden change in direction only, the steady, viscous flow of the deep. The sound of the current is a low-frequency vibration, a subsonic resonance that hums through the calcified carapaces of the trilobites and the hollow chambers of the orthocones. It is a world of heavy, saline syrup moving at the pace of a slow breath. This movement acted as a biological clock, a rhythmic pulse that dictated when the graptolite colonies would feed, and when the brachiopod carpets would open their valves to the nutrient-rich stream. It was the heartbeat of the abyss, a steady, unhurried flow that ensured that no corner of the blue was ever truly stagnant. The chemistry of the current was a masterwork of planetary balance. As the water traveled from the polar sinks toward the tropical basins, it collected the chemical signatures of everything it touched: the mineral wash from the tectonic mountains, the organic snow of the Gobi, and the dissolved gases of the atmosphere. This made the current a liquid archive, a moving library of information that the inhabitants could read through their chemical sensors and sensitive tentacles. For the Cameroceras, the current was a roadmap, a way to navigate the vertical wilderness by following the scent of cold, oxygenated water. To move against the current was a feat of strength. To move with it was a surrender to the fundamental rhythm of the earth. It was a force that rendered the concept of the individual irrelevant, subsuming every life into the greater collective motion of the sea. As we immerse ourselves in this eternal flow, the frantic energy of the surface world begins to fade. We are no longer observing a prehistoric era, we are becoming part of its movement. The current is a bridge across deep time, a physical link that connects the Ordovician basins to the oceans of our own day. The water that once bathed the gills of the jawless fish still circulates, in some form, within the deep trenches of the modern world, a tireless traveller that has witnessed the rise and fall of every dynasty. There is a profound peace in this realization that beneath the chaos of history, there is a constant, rhythmic and indifferent motion that persists. The eternal current is the breath of the planet, a slow and steady inhalation that carries us deeper into the night, toward a state of perfect hydrostatic equilibrium. The descent is complete, and the weight of the water now rests comfortably upon the senses, a heavy, liquid blanket that has smoothed the edges of the world. We have travelled through the vertical cathedrals of the Ordovician, moving from the sunlit explosion of the Great Diversification into the bruised indigo of the glacial freeze. and finally into the absolute stillness of the deep-sea muds. Here, the giants are no longer hunters, they are the architecture of the Earth. The great Cameroceras and its kin have found their final equilibrium, their shells becoming one with the limestone foundations of the future. The frantic struggle for oxygen, the rhythmic clicking of the trilobites' crawl, and the predatory flare of tentacles have all dissolved into a singular, silent permanence. There is no more distance to travel, no more time to measure. The Ordovician has been folded away into the strata of the planet, a secret kept in the dark by the crushing embrace of the sea. As the consciousness drifts further into this prehistoric night, the boundaries of the present become indistinguishable from the depths of the past. The internal monologue of the human mind is replaced by the low-frequency hum of the abyssa subsonic vibration that carries the resonance of 450 million years. We are suspended in a state of perfect buoyancy, neither rising nor falling, but simply existing within the heavy saline syrup of deep time. The light of the modern world is a distant, forgotten dream. In this sanctuary of stone and silt, the pressure is not a burden, but a comfort. A constant reminder that we are supported by the entire mass of the ocean's history. The air we once breathed is irrelevant here. We have returned to the source, to the cold, mineralized cradle where the blueprints of our own survival were first drafted. The ghosts of the giant shells flicker in the periphery of the mind-long, tapering shadows that move with a ghostly, horizontal grace through the void. They do not hurry, and neither do we. The pace of the deep is a glacial pulse, a rhythm so slow it feels like a cessation of movement. We feel the slow accumulation of the marine snow, the microscopic drizzle of the ages settling upon the benthos, burying the triumphs and the tragedies of the globe under a blanket of velvet dust. This is the ultimate rest, a surrender to the entropy that turns biology into geology. The Earth is breathing in a slow tectonic cycle, and we are the passengers within that breath, drifting through the dark toward a destination that has already been reached. The silence is not empty. It is a dense, meaningful presence, the accumulated piece of 100 million years of undisturbed darkness. As the final currents of the Ordovician wash over us, the senses go quiet. The cold is no longer felt as a chill, but as a clarity. The dark is no longer seen as a void, but as a completion. We are the witnesses of the eternal dark, the drifters of the liquid void, the heirs to the kingdom of the shells. The world above continues its frantic sunlit dance, but down here, in the crushing heart of the Paleozoic, there is only the rhythmic, indifferent pulse of the planet. The giant shells have taught us the lesson of the deep, that to endure is to become as patient as the stone, as heavy as the water, and as silent as the stars. Sleep now, beneath the weight of the eternal sea, where the Ordovician deep remains forever still, forever dark, and forever home.